Hello, I'm Natalie Aho, the new program manager for the Baptist Commons here at Wake Divinity. The Baptist Commons is a network of diverse communities of Baptists committed to justice, reconciliation, and compassion. We provide events, resources, and services to our students, alumni, and supporters. Today, I'm welcoming you to our first event of the new academic year called Common Conversations. Moderated by folks from our network, these are conversations between an expert and members of our faculty here at Wake Divinity. This fall, we are focusing on 3 topics under the theme of the weight of racism. As architects of equity, hope, and healing, we feel there is no more important conversation than to talk about racism in America. The weight of this injustice is on us all. As our beloved deacon, Maya Angelou, once said, it is impossible to talk about equal rights, civil rights for Blacks, without including whites. For equal rights, fair play, justice, they are like the air. We all have it, or none of us has it. We hope that you'll do more than just watch. We hope that you will be inspired to start your own conversations after you listen to ours, and that you too will continue the call to be agents of justice, reconciliation, and compassion.
My name is Reverend Darrell Hamilton, and I would like to welcome you to the first episode of Wake Divinity Common Conversations with our topic, the load of Christian nationalism and Baptist history. We are here today with 2 experts, 2 good friends of mine, 2 really important mentors in my own life journey and my own vocational discernment. And I would like to welcome here with us today, Amanda Tyler, JD, and Executive Director of Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, or just BJC. Dr. Bill Leonard, Founding Dean, Faculty Emeritus, and Baptist Historian Extraordinaire of Wake Divinity. And again, I am Reverend Darrell Hamilton, a Wake Div alum from the class of 2017, pastor for Formation and Outreach at the First Baptist Church in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. And I am also a former Wake Divinity Moyer Scholar intern at BJC. I will be moderating today's conversation, and we are really in for a good one with these 2 experts, these 2 friends and 2 mentors joining us today. So I would like us to get started, and Amanda, if you don't mind, I'd like to kick it off to you. Could you just explain to us what exactly is Christian nationalism? And with that, can you also explain to us the relationship between Christian nationalism and white supremacy?
Yes, well, it's great to be here with you, Darrell, and with Bill in this common conversation. And I think that's a perfect place to start. And we really need to have a common language around Christian nationalism. And as prevalent as it is, I find when I'm talking about it that a lot of people in the audience aren't exactly sure about what I mean by the term Christian nationalism. So when I use that term, I think the best definition is that Christian nationalism is a cultural framework that tries to merge our identities as Christians and as Americans. Put another way, Christian nationalism suggests that to be a true American, one needs to be Christian, or to be a true Christian, one needs to be American. And of course, nothing could be farther from the truth. Christian nationalism tends to rely heavily on a mythological founding of the United States as a, quote, Christian nation. And, that term can mean a lot of things to different people as well. So, in some ways, the United States is a majority Christian nation. That is true. But most people who talk about U.S. as a Christian nation really aren't talking about demographics. They're talking about this idea of the founding as somehow that God singled out the United States for special gifts, or for that the founding was a providential move, that the United States was founded by Christians for Christians. It's also, I could define it as almost like a supercharged civil religion, or an extension of American exceptionalism. And to get to your statement or question about how it how it relates to white nationalism. I think it's not the same, but there certainly is a lot of overlap because Christian nationalism tends to overlap with and provide cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. And a lot of that starts with the kind of history that it relies upon, right? This idea, when they talk about the founding of the United States as a Christian nation, they're talking about a white Christian nation. They are ignoring indigenous and Black bodies and slavery when they're making that statement. And so they don't have to be overtly racist in their language when they talk about the founding as a Christian nation. And I also think that Christian nationalism has a lot in common with racism. Like racism, it's pervasive. It touches every aspect of American society. And so it's also, just like I don't find it very helpful to talk about who is and is not a racist, because we all live in a racist society. It's better to talk about and identify Christian nationalism rather than trying to identify particular people as Christian nationalists, right? And so we are all impacted by Christian nationalism to different degrees. And so understanding that, not immediately as an indictment of us personally, but understanding it helps us work through that. Christian nationalism also, it all, I think about some of the shootings in synagogues as examples of Christian nationalism. But just like racism or white supremacy, we do a disservice if we concentrate too much on those really overt violent examples. Those are important to point out. But Christian nationalism also shows up in more subtle ways. It shows up in our civic life, in, for instance, state legislative bills that would post "In God We Trust" and all of the walls of public school buildings. When we used to send our children to public schools before they shut down, we would see that was a big item. It also shows up in our sanctuaries when we see American flags on the altar in a lot of sanctuaries. So I'm just pointing out some of the examples of Christian nationalism. And just as I kind of close this definitional section, I want to break down the Christian and the nationalism. This is not a religion, it's a political ideology, but it does rely heavily on a religion. But Christian nationalism is really more about identity than religion. And nationalism, I think it's important to distinguish that from patriotism. That patriotism is love of country, but nationalism is a kind of a supercharged patriotism that requires some kind of blind allegiance to the state in different ways. So I hope that kind of gives us some texture for the conversation when we talk about Christian nationalism.
Oh, most definitely. That gives like some wonderful texture to the conversation, and is really enlightening and really helpful to really grasp such a complicated and really important topic that is pervasive in our world right now. One of the things that you said, though, that really stuck out to me was, saying that Christian nationalism, has its root sort of in this mythological founding of the United States as a Christian nation, right? And so hearing that as sort of, being that Christian nationalism is tied to this misrepresentation of history, of American history, of Christian history. And so, Dr. Leonard, I wanted to ask you, actually, while our audience does include many who are not Baptist, why, though, would we need to talk about the relationship between Baptist history and Christian nationalism? Can you speak a little bit to that today, sir?
Thank you, Reverend. It's good to be with all of you today. Baptists as a movement are difficult to talk about because there are so many Baptist groups that span a whole theological spectrum from primitive Baptists on the Calvinistic end of the spectrum to free will Baptists on the more Arminian or free will part of the spectrum. So I'm going to generalize about early Baptists and some of the lessons we learned from them about these kinds of questions. Baptists really began as a movement around the year 1609 in Holland. And they really start with the assertion that what we are calling Christian nationalism is closely related to a uniform and enforced conformity to one kind of Christian tradition, a church-state coalition in which to be born into a specific European country requires baptism into one kind of Christian church, what we would call a religious establishment that was state privileged and defined the nature of Christianity for almost all the citizens. In other words, to be French and Italian was to be Roman Catholic. To be German was to be Lutheran. To be British was to be Anglican. Baptists resisted that kind of religious uniformity and pressed for religious liberty for those who believed and those who didn't. That is, early Baptists said, God alone is judge of conscience, and neither the official state or its official church can judge the conscience of the heretic, the people who are thought to believe the wrong things, or the atheists, the people who don't believe at all. In that, they were among the first Protestants to envision a state where what we now call religious pluralism exists for Christian religionists, for non-Christian religionists, and for those who claim no religion at all. In America, particularly in the colonial period, Baptists make that point significantly, especially in New England and Virginia, where there were religious establishments, the Puritans in New England and the Anglicans in Virginia. And our teacher in much of that is the person I call the quintessential or the quintessential American dissenter and the erstwhile, meaning not constant, Baptist, and that is Roger Williams, who founded the first Baptist church in America at Providence. And then he followed another Baptist practice. He quit being one. And in doing that, he was clear that there are no Christian nations, only Christian people bound to Christ, not by citizenship, but by faith. That was a very important distinction, and it was unique in that time. As a matter of fact, after years of talking about and reading Williams, I stay amazed that he and his colleague in Newport, Rhode Island, John Clark, who did stay a Baptist, saw in their era these ideas of religious liberty and a response to Christian nationalism that so few religious leaders around them saw at the times. And Williams was clear again that the idea of Christian nation was actually idolatry, and that the nation should be a place at its best where people have the freedom to choose to believe or not to believe, and to choose to believe the doctrines and the interpretation of Scripture that their conscience guides them toward. Unfortunately, however, many 21st century Baptists have moved away from that tradition and are moving in many ways toward a Christian nationalist position that seems, at least to me, foreign to the origins of the Baptist community.
Wow, thank you for sharing all of that with us, Dr. Leonard. So helpful, so enlightening. And I think a lot of what you're raising, what makes it so important for our day, and especially really important for this conversation, is, as you said, there are so many Baptist movements throughout history, but seeing the way in which the Baptist movement is continuing to go in the 21st century really is eye-opening to get a grasp of this larger question around Christian nationalism. And so that also then leads me to want to come back to you, Amanda, actually, because I'm really compelled by what Dr. Leonard was sharing from Roger Williams. And again, he said, quoting Roger Williams, there are no Christian nations, only Christian people bound to Christ by faith. And so thinking about your work with BJC, why then should BJC have a voice in this conversation around Christian nationalism? And tell us about why an organization like BJC would be compelled to educate the public about Christian nationalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways, BJC, which, as you said, stands for Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, we see ourselves as the modern day heirs to people like Roger Williams, people who fought for faith freedom for all people, for themselves, but also for people of other faiths and people who didn't claim a faith tradition. And, in recent days, and when I say days, I mean really years and decades, we have seen an erosion of an understanding of what religious freedom for all people means, as Bill pointed out, within the Baptist family itself, but also within the greater culture. And so, we for decades, BJC has been pushing back against the myths that underlie Christian nationalism and the founding of the so-called founding of the country as a Christian nation. But I think over the past few years, we've really seen rising incidents of Christian nationalism, as we've also seen more and more misunderstanding about what religious freedom really means. And when we hear that term sometimes now, it really is invoked by people who I think are fearing the loss of Christian privilege. And Christian nationalism, implicit in that is Christian privilege, this idea that Christianity should be privileged by the state, and in fact, is meant to be privileged by the state. Nothing could be farther from the truth from a constitutional perspective. Those Baptists that Bill was telling us about fought for disestablishment of an organized religion and for a government that would remain neutral when it comes to religion. And so, but last year, BJC really seeing these rising incidents of Christian nationalism and more misunderstanding about what religious freedom even means, we started a project called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We launched this project, but in coalition with a number of other faith groups who were also concerned about Christian nationalism. And we thought that as Christians, we had a special responsibility to raise awareness about this, not only in the greater culture, but within our own ranks. And so we launched a website called christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. And core to this initiative is a statement of principles that anyone who self-identifies as a Christian is welcome to sign on to. And I was struck by that quote that Bill gave from Roger Williams, because in our statement, we say, as Christians, we are bound to Christ, not by citizenship, but by faith. And then we go through core principles of religious freedom. These principles are things like people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. We also say government should not prefer one religion over another or religion over non-religion. These Christians say religious instruction is best left to our houses of worship, other religious institutions, and families. We affirm that America's historic commitment to religious pluralism enables faith communities to live in civic harmony with one another without sacrificing our theological convictions. These are really just restatements of core principles of religious freedom. So while we are raising awareness of what Christian nationalism is, we are also hoping to educate and raise awareness about what religious freedom is, and how when we lean into the promises of religious freedom, that can push back and work almost as an antidote to what we consider a poison when it comes to Christian nationalism. So while the initiative, sounds negative, Christians against Christian nationalism, the core statement of beliefs is really something that we can all be for. The initiative is also hoping to bring together many different kinds of Christians, Christians who disagree on theology, Christians who have different political positions, might take different positions on issues of moral concern, but they can agree on these bedrock principles of faith, freedom for all. And that we can invite people into conversation with us to understand what Christian nationalism is. And so on this website, people are invited to sign the statement, but also to get the resources they might need to have conversations in their faith communities and broader communities, maybe even around the dinner table with people to help understand Christian nationalism. And so we have a lot of resources, including a 10-part podcast series that BJC produced last year, and that Dr. Leonard was actually one of our guests for that series, along with a discussion guide, so people can learn more through the podcast series. So yes, we at BJC have really invested a lot of time and energy into this topic because we think understanding Christian nationalism and how it operates is really core to protecting religious freedom for all people.
Thank you, Amanda. I wanted to actually add another question, sort of prompted by what you were raising, and there's a pastor of mine who's a favorite of mine, Howard John Wesley, ain't too far from y'all at BJC. He has a phrase where he says, "Can I push it?" And so I wanted to see if I could maybe push it a little bit with this question, because I like what you said about leaning into the promises for religious freedom as a way to sort of counteract or work against the poison, you said, of Christian nationalism. And so seeing, in our, contemporary context, what I've kind of called in my, in preaching from the pulpit, the crisis of 2020, and we're, on the eve of an upcoming election. We're right in the middle of a COVID-19, pandemic. We also have the pandemic of police brutality and continuing to raise conversations around systemic racism and anti-Black violence. And so what makes this conversation about religious freedom or leaning into the promise of religious freedom, how does that relate to the current challenges that we find ourselves living through right now in the year 2020 in relationship to the conversation around Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent next step, Darrell, because when I talk about the promise of religious freedom, implicit in that is that we haven't lived up to that promise. And I think the existence of Christian nationalism itself shows that we haven't lived up to that promise. If we have this powerful ideology out there that suggests a privileged position for Christians and really white Christians in this country, that shows that we haven't achieved religious freedom for all people. And I think that we see the gap in promise and reality when you talk about the many crises that we're facing as a country this year. And understanding Christian nationalism can help us understand a lot of those problems. And here I rely very heavily on two experts in the field, sociologists of religion, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, who have written a really great book called Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. And I would highly recommend this book, but they've done a number of different surveys about Christian nationalism and seen that across multiple academic studies using large nationally representative surveys, that Americans who embrace Christian nationalism are more likely to do a number of things. And I'm just going to read some of these examples of how Christian nationalism shows up. They're more likely to approve of authoritarian tactics, like demanding people show respect for national symbols and traditions, more likely to fear and distrust religious minorities, including Muslims, atheists, and Jewish people. They're more likely to condone police violence toward Black Americans and distrust accounts of racial inequality in the criminal justice system. They're more likely to believe that racial inequality is due to the personal shortcomings of minority groups. They report being very uncomfortable with both interracial marriage and transracial adoption. They are more likely to hold anti-immigrant views and to fear refugees, to oppose scientists and science education in schools, and they're more likely to believe that men are better suited for all leadership roles, while women are better suited to care for children in the home. And so understanding how Christian nationalism actually impacts all of these things, I think can help us get to some of these root problems that are really troubling the United States right now. And I would refer, if people are like, really? Is that really the case? I would refer them back to the Christians Against Christian Nationalism website and the resources section, where we've posted some of the academic studies that back this up. And once you kind of get into the study, it turns out that more than religious affiliation, this idea of where you are in a Christian nationalism spectrum is more likely to tell you how people come out on some of these really pressing issues.
Darrell, I would add to that wonderful summary that one of the crises that we're going through in 2020 and beyond, I'm sure, is this idea that at one point in time or some point in time, there was this mythic or idyllic America that was shaped by some of the earlier issues that were in many ways anchored in white supremacy. We were in charge. We knew how to be Americans. We knew what America meant. We knew who was trying to interfere with that view of America. And now as that, and this has happened all the way through the history of the country, that the whole, that old line, no Irish need apply, was a reaction against that when the Irish Catholics came in the 19th century. So we're really at this point of deciding among many crises, what kind of nation are we going to be, and what does democracy and pluralism mean, and how is opening that door to those diverse visions more American than not.
I'm really glad you said that, Dr. Leonard. And just as an aside, I know you told me that I should call you Bill, but unfortunately, just the Southern in me won't allow me to do that just yet. I haven't quite earned that yet. But if you'll indulge me to continue to call you Dr. Leonard for just a few more seasons. But I think you are going in a direction that I was actually hoping to ask you to take us. And as you were saying, thinking about, as a nation, like what sort of nation are we looking or wanting to be? What sort of democracy are we looking and wanting to be? What would you say that we as Baptists, as Americans, we as people of conscience or of goodwill, people of faith, however we might identify, what would you say that we can learn, or maybe what we should look to learn from history in order to help us cast a vision for the future?
I think that as Christians and as American citizens, we must not simply live out the creed that all women and men are created equal, but we have to live beyond white supremacy, racism, and broken theology that in the past has kept us from living out that creed, even when we said it wasn't. In doing that, I think we have to also own, repent, and live freer and better than our past. That may also mean not that we can repent for slavery and racism, for those who promoted slavery and racism and Jim Crow and the like. We can't repent for them, but we can repent from them to another vision of America that they either didn't get to or didn't want to see, that we must respond to, not only in light, I think, of this creed that all are created equal, but in terms of simply loving our neighbor as ourselves, which, by the way, was one of the verses that abolitionists used most frequently in responding to these biblical defenses of slavery. Like the Baptists who challenged the privilege and establishmentarianism of deals cut by church and state, we must reject what I would call a neo-establishmentarianism that attempts to, going on something that Amanda said, that attempts to privilege one kind of faith as the American faith. And we must be vigilant in the face of efforts to reassert white supremacy and privilege in, for example, limiting voting rights with laws aimed at voters of color. We must also do well to reconnect with the power of dissent for conscience sake. One of the characteristics of the early Baptist was as a dissenting movement, not only about church-state affiliation, but about the role of the gospel in shaping human and churchly relationships, encouraging churches to raise, at times, perhaps even to what I've called raise gospel bail money for those who are imprisoned or arrested for the sake of conscience, as not only protesting, but giving witness to another way of understanding the nature of the American Republic and the nature of the Christian gospel.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Leonard. Amanda, I'd actually like to pull you in on this same question to get a sense of maybe if you don't necessarily want to tie it to the history, but what do you think is needed or what we should be doing in order to sort of cast a vision for the future? How would you engage that?
Well, and I would pick up on what Bill talked about theology and reclaiming this idea of theology, because one of the many evils of Christian nationalism is the way that it perverts Christianity. And, you know, some would argue it's been perverted beyond recognition in a lot of ways and want to restart the whole thing, you know, but this idea of not letting scripture be used by those in power to perpetuate a privileged place for Christians and really only a certain kind of Christian, that provides, I think, a real clarion call for change. And that's what a lot of what is motivating this Christians Against Christian Nationalism movement as well, that from people of faith who still claim a label of Christian, they are concerned about what Christian nationalism is doing to their faith. And also, you know, to pick up on that other strand of the importance and the power of dissent, that once you really buy into Christian nationalism, that you're so merged with the state that you can't speak truth to power in an authentic way. So I think that pushing back against Christian nationalism means also leaning into a rediscovery of theology and scripture, one that isn't tied to some earthly kingdom or need to perpetuate a government in power. And it also means rediscovering a prophetic voice.
Thank you both very much for your thoughtful and really helpful responses. We're getting ready to move into a time of Q&A, but I would be remiss to not ask a question of my own. I'm definitely not trying to over-insert myself into the conversation, but recognizing just, this in the middle of this conversation, not only do I hold an intersection between, my experience as a grad of Wake Divinity and also as a former intern of BJC, but also, as a Black Baptist preacher and pastor, I am a product of the legacy that is Christian nationalism. I am a son of the history of Christian nationalism. I come from descendants and ancestors, and I actually have been doing this work recently and able to really actually trace my ancestry back all the way to, I believe, like, the 1600s in Virginia. I found an ancestor directly from Africa, and so I am a descendant of a people who experienced the theology, as you were naming, Amanda, that was used for our subjugation. I come from a legacy and a history, a rich history of descent, not only as a Baptist, not only as a Black man, but also as a Black Baptist. Because the whole establishment of Black Baptist identity within itself is a product of descent, of this tradition of descent. And so I'm just wanted to ask, the both of you, what would then, in your words, make this conversation, really, relevant for someone like myself? Like why is this conversation even so important that we have it right now in this common conversation setting? Me as a moderator, what makes this conversation so relevant today for many people like myself who have been, recipients of and who have been impacted by this legacy and this history of Christian nationalism?
Well, what immediately comes to mind for me, Darrell, is when we talked about Christian nationalism and we talked about how closely that is associated with whiteness and white Christian nationalism. And I think it's important that we also, talk about the ways that religious liberty and religious freedom has often been seen almost entirely within a white framework in this country. When we hold up heroes of religious freedom, most of them we talk about are white Baptists. And we at BJC are really leaning into our history and trying to understand and bring in more diverse voices for religious freedom, because they've always been there, but they haven't always gotten their due in a country that is so influenced by Christian nationalism. So, I think this idea of being able to open up our understanding of what it means to be a Christian in the United States, as well as what it means to be an American, and to think about all of the incredible contributions of all kinds of people, including many Black Baptists, to the history of religious freedom and to the history of this country, that really gives a strong interest in pushing back against Christian nationalism and will further enrich our understanding of what a robust religious freedom for all could really look like. So what an inspiring story to talk about, your own research into your ancestry and to know how much of you is from that tradition, that strong tradition of descent, I think is really crucial and important to breaking down the myth of the myth of, United States as a Christian nation, breaking down, Christian nationalism as such a driving force in our culture today.
Darrell, I also think that it's important that we tell the truth about our Baptist past as well as our American past, which means we have, particularly those of us who are Baptists in the South, white Baptists in the South, we have to be able to reflect on and retell the horror stories that were perpetuated through Baptist churches, other churches too, but I'll just talk about my own family of faith, that utilized national law to hold people in bondage. And I have to always remember that in 1822, one of the first and most elaborate defenses of slavery, biblical defenses of slavery, came from Richard Furman, the pastor of First Baptist Church, Charleston, South Carolina, when he wrote, and here's the nationalism, he wrote to the governor of South Carolina in this exposition in late 1822, calling the governor to declare a day of prayer and thanksgiving that the Denmark-Vesey alleged rebellion in Charleston related to an African Methodist Episcopal Church we now know as Mother Emanuel, that that rebellion had been put down by the providence of God that had protected the white people. And in doing that, he lays out this biblical argument in which he says, had the holding of slaves been a moral evil, it cannot be supposed that the holy apostles who feared not the faces of men would have tolerated it for a moment in the Christian church. And here, nationalism, scripture, and slavery are all put together around a slave rebellion. And we have to keep telling that story. And we have to talk about Jim Crow, and we have to talk about the slave-related origins of so many institutions. It's been my privilege to serve on a committee at Wake Forest University, one of many such committees at schools of higher education, from Georgetown to University of Virginia to Furman and to Baylor University, that was looking at the slave-related origins of these schools and to owning the fact that many of these schools began with slaveholding faculty, administrators, and supporters. But, and I'll add one more thing, we also have to remember that there's another story, and my favorite one about that is the story of the slave woman named Winnie, who is a member of the Forks of Elkhorn Baptist Church in Kentucky, who in 1806 is brought for disciplinary action before the church, the White Baptist Church, where she was a member, for saying that she once thought it her duty to serve her mistress and her master. But since the Lord had converted her, she had never believed that white people could keep Negroes in bondage. Now, that woman heard the gospel in a church that was trying to keep her from hearing that idea of liberation. But in spite of that, she heard and articulated the gospel, and they disciplined her and put her out of the church, by the way. So we have to tell those stories, but also acknowledge the power of the gospel for liberation and freedom, even in those who at that moment in time may have been denied that liberty.
Wow, thank you both so much. This was so rich and so helpful. Even all these years later, I'm still a student sitting at the feet of you both, learning and receiving so much wisdom. So thank y'all so much for sharing that. We are actually going to now transition to a time of Q&A, and we have a few people who are joining us today who have some questions for Amanda and Bill. And so we are going to turn it over to them now.
Hey y'all, thanks for doing this session. It's great to be here with you. My name is Courtney Stamey, graduate of class of 2015. I'm the senior pastor at Northside Baptist Church in Clinton, Mississippi. In Mississippi, we have a vote to change our state flag on the ballot in November. And our state legislature decided to change from our former flag, which had the Confederate battle emblem in the corner, to a new flag with the stipulation that the new flag have the words, "In God we trust" on it. How can Christians who are against Christian nationalism wade into these murky waters?
Thank you so much, Courtney, for that question. And to answer your question directly about how should you wade into the murky waters, I say very carefully, and thank you for being willing to do so, to be that voice of dissent. I'm not a citizen of Mississippi, but I am going to say I think it's really important that the state remove the Confederate battle emblem from the state flag, but to replace it with these words, "In God we trust," which just infuses a new kind of exclusion, I think, to the state, is really troubling. I mentioned earlier when we were talking about examples of Christian nationalism, a movement to put "In God we trust" on the walls of every public school classroom. And the people who defend that decision say, it's a national motto. And it's true that since the 1950s, it has been a national motto. But to put it without additional context on something like a school wall where every child would see it, or here on the state flag where everyone sees it, sends a message that if you don't trust in God, then you are not one of us. You are not welcome here. It also raises the question of why God is on a national flag at all, as if to be to be in Mississippi or to be in the United States, that those are the only people who trust in God. So I do think that adding this motto of Christian nationalism on any flag is is not a good choice, is moving in the wrong direction. I think that as a Christian, I think that the most productive voice that you might have in your state right now is just to start asking questions about what that statement really means, to really get at some of the underlying assumptions of that statement, and to help people understand why that might be problematic for some people, to see that on the flag, not just people who are not Christian, but also for Christians, because, leaning into that, it starts treading very dangerously into the territory of idolatry, as we talked about earlier. When you question who are you pledging allegiance to, especially when you see "In God We Trust" on the flag, it merges things in really troubling ways. And so I think this is a real point and opportunity of education, and I would commend the Christians Against Christian Nationalism resources to you as you try to have those difficult conversations in your state.
I would absolutely agree with Amanda and simply add the very fact that this is a trade-off, apparently. Okay, we'll get rid of the battle flag that is so representative of racism from another era, we hope, and not the present day. But in order to do that and get enough votes to make that possible, we have to give on what I would call an example of something I named as neo-establishmentarianism, because, as Amanda said, it does eliminate a whole group of people. In our country right now, 23% or people who call themselves non-affiliated or nuns or nons represent 23% of the population, the same percentage roughly as Roman Catholics and as evangelicals, illustrates the difficulty of trying to enforce God language on a state symbol. And that's just highly problematic. But it illustrates also how deep are the issues of Christian nationalism that we've been talking about today, and how that this trade-off was seen by certain politicians as the only way to get the flag removed. And that's a reality that I think requires the witness of those who see problems with both of these kind of responses, and government enforcement of those racist and or religious symbols, quasi-religious symbols, actually.
Hello, Amanda, Bill, and Darrell. Andrew Gardner, class of 15 here. I am currently visiting associate faculty of American Religious History and Louisville Institute postdoctoral research fellow at Hartford Seminary and Hartford Institute for Religion Research, and a current BJC board member. I had a question for Amanda. Last year, BJC appointed a special committee on race and religious liberty to interrogate the organization's history and in many respects its failures with respects to racial representation on the board. Can you speak to why it's important for organizations like BJC to pursue this work?
Well, thank you, Andrew, for that question. Thank you also for your service as a board member for BJC and for your service to the Special Committee on Race and Religious Liberty. So more than a year ago, the board of directors of BJC appointed this committee to look at our history. And I think to Bill's point earlier, we saw the need to tell the truth. There was an aspect of our history that was actually brought to light in an academic's book on religious freedom, Professor Dr. Tisa Winger raised this aspect of our history from the 1940s about the board of directors' response to one of the board members who asked the committee to get involved in racial justice issues. And so we felt the need to understand and tell our history. And so over the past year, this committee has been working. Its work continues, and we will, be talking about that work publicly at a later time. But I think that it is vital for institutions of all kinds to really understand their history and not take their history and the stories they've been told of their history at face value. I think that is a great lesson of Christian nationalism. I think it's a lesson of the racial reckoning that we're coming to now, that history is a dynamic thing and that it is our responsibility to understand our history, to learn from it, and to make our choices and our actions now reflect that better understanding of where we are. BJC, we trace our origins to 1936, obviously after slavery in this country, but racism continues to pervade even to the present day. And so I think any organization today, has an obligation to interrogate their history and understand where there might have been shortcomings, either of commission or omission, to understand that history and to move forward in a spirit of reparation and justice.
My name is Jada Williams. I am a dual degree student at Wake University pursuing a Juris Doctorate and a Master of Divinity. I will graduate with both degrees in 2024. My question for Dr. Leonard and Amanda is, as we find ourselves on the heels of the Breonna Taylor verdict, I'm wondering how the implications of the verdict are related to Christian nationalism and what this means for our understandings of biblical justice.
That's an amazingly insightful and complex and in many ways passionate question that I think that particular circumstance as one illustration of police violence against African Americans in this country just in this year has punctuated for the entire culture. I think that it calls us back to energizing and de-energizing of both local and national groups who speak out against this in behalf of justice and in behalf of fair treatment and behalf of police reformation. One of the things that I hope Jada would encourage you for this is the fact that significant religious communities and religious leaders in Louisville have played a very important role in even helping to get this case brought to trial and to have a public forum regarding those kinds of issues. I lived in Louisville for 17 years and know many of these religious leaders and have been in touch with them, but they both, many of them took to the streets in public protest with others who were dissenting both against the action of the police and now the judgment of the grand jury. But they also went straight to the mayor and other political leaders and made their case for how reform was necessary and response to this particular issue and Breonna Taylor's family especially needed to be much more intense and explicit. And I think that's given me some hope for the future in the way in which religious communities responded to this terrible action and the crisis, political and regional, that it evoked.
And I would just add, I agree, this is a really complex question, and it helps really understand how understanding Christian nationalism can help us understand how different faith communities might approach this topic. And I think speaking for the other faith communities who either spoke out in favor of law enforcement or the verdict in this area, or stayed silent, in the face of, I think, what is an obvious miscarriage of justice here. How could they do that? How does Christian nationalism play in? And I think one of the key biblical texts on which Christian nationalism relies is Romans 13, which I think is a very misunderstood and misinterpreted section of Paul's writings, where it talks about submitting to the authority of the state. And it has been misused by oppressors over many centuries for that very use. And so it should not be surprising, but it should still be horrifying when we see even modern day people using Romans 13 to somehow justify an unjust justice system. That instead of speaking that voice of dissent about what real justice might look like. And it also speaks to the caution of those who are so reliant on state power for their religious power that then their voices are silenced when otherwise, I think their faith tradition would call them to speak truth to power in a moment of violence and oppression.
I'm Rebecca Wiggs. I'm an attorney in Jackson, Mississippi in private practice, and I also serve on the Wake Forest Divinity School Board of Visitors. Here's my question for Dean Leonard and for Amanda. 2 Supreme Court justices have now signaled their wish to fix the problem the court created in the Obergefell decision, the 2015 order that allowed for same-sex marriages, where the court endorsed in their words, quote, a novel constitutional right over the religious liberty interests explicitly protected in the First Amendment, close quote. How might Baptists react to another shift in this particular load we've just gotten adjusted to carrying? And does our history and our polity give Baptist communities a way to remain supportive of both religious freedom proponents and our LGBTQ family of faith members?
I think that's the test that is one of multiple tests that the changes in the Supreme Court have made or are talking about making or will make. And this is going to be a very controversial moment in the Supreme Court, particularly if one more judge is appointed who moves toward the right on many of these issues. And I think it does raise this question again of religious privilege. One of the interesting things to me has been that this question related to religious liberty and LGBTQ laws and protection, and now the marriage issue has been really asking people to shape their religious freedom in terms of their own biases. This was not uncommon with the effort against Brown versus the Board of Education, or many of the legislative efforts of the civil rights movement. I think this is very problematic, particularly that they have come out so quickly on these statements in the midst of a political year and a highly politicized moment in the culture. And so I think that this is going to put Baptists in a situation where the diversity of interpretations of religious liberty, which we've been talking about today, are becoming more pronounced and divisive in terms of how individual Baptists and Baptist denominations and individuals, pastors and congregations are going to divide over these matters. And this is going to be a long struggle, I think, that will help. And I think we need to be clear, those of us who have talked about Christian nationalism and its role in these kinds of decisions for people on the margins, we're going to have to be clear about our own convictions and our willingness to respond to the changes that are being, I would say, threatened.
Yeah, and Rebecca, I would just add, I think that this statement from the justices, it was a short statement that Justice Thomas wrote and was joined by Justice Alito, that it really is a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier when people claim a severe infringement on their religious freedom, and they are talking about a loss of religious privilege. And it really is in the eye of the beholder, because what they're reacting to was the opinion written by Justice Kennedy in Obergefell, which BJC said at the time treated religious interests in a very respectful way, but in Justice Thomas and Alito's perspective, they read that same opinion and saw Justice Kennedy calling religious dissenters on this issue of gay marriage, calling them bigots, right? And so they've really turned up the dial on this conflict between an expansion of non-discrimination in the United States and certain religious liberty interests. And I think it's really important for Baptists who have long championed religious freedom for all to help understand that religious freedom does not mean that the state will enshrine your morality into law. And when the state enshrines something that is contrary to your religious views, that the state will work with you to provide accommodations when possible, but that just enshrining something that is contrary to your religious values is not necessarily an infringement on your religious freedom. And if we can be very clear about where those lines are and not, as these justices did, engage in some kind of hyperbolic response that's really unhelpful to what is a very difficult debate right now, I think that's how we can best show a witness here, and one that we will, be fighting, I think, for some time now. That the changes in the Supreme Court are just making this more difficult, and that's when we have to be more clear and hew more closely to our founding principles.
Hello, I am Darnysha Nard, a Wake Div candidate from 2017. So I think many of us, particularly those of us on this panel, tend to think of white nationalism as monolithic and as something that is easy to see. And throughout my lifetime, I've seen it evolve, especially now, into something that is more nuanced. While recently applying for ministry jobs, I have seen this nuance in action. During a recent interview at a majority white church, someone from HR stated that they had done some sleuthing and saw my social media. They claimed to be supporters of BLM, like Black Lives Matter and other social justice oriented stances and movements, but had raised eyebrows about my recent posts about protests, supporting bail funds for people who were wrongfully charged and arrested. They asked if I was hired, would I be willing to remove said posts and solely support the position of the organization? So that is my question. What does it look like to use church privilege to take a stance against white nationalism in congregations that do not politically lean left or right, but maintain steadfast in the middle? And when is the time to follow or lead a congregation against white nationalism? And as a woman of color, how do I encourage my peers to join me, or is this another thankless solo mission?
Well, thanks, Darnysha, for your question, for your vulnerability, for your honesty. I think that that's a very brave move and one that's needed, this kind of truth telling in this moment. I would say initially that this kind of conversation is exactly what BJC hoped to have with the Christians Against Christian Nationalism project. That we think it's really important for us to understand Christian nationalism or white nationalism, how it shows up in subtle ways, in nuanced ways, as you put it, for us to draw attention to us, to interrogate those assumptions, to understand it. And so, this initiative, these materials that we have are there for congregations all across the theological spectrum. And, I think that they're sometimes uncomfortable conversations for congregations to have, to really start to interrogate what some of these assumptions are, kind of back to where I started at the beginning, talking when I was defining Christian nationalism, that Christian nationalism is pervasive, that it impacts all of us. And so coming at that from a place of humility and understanding that we're not out there, just to call out the most violent extremes. So we're there to help recognize how Christian nationalism is holding us back as a society, and yes, as a church and as a religious people, so that we can start to move forward all together. And so I certainly hope that efforts like Christians Against Christian Nationalism will bring your peers out of the woodwork to help support you, because this has to be something that those of us who are most impacted, and yes, who have most benefited from Christian nationalism, we have to be the ones to lead in calling it out. And so I hope to be, your peer, your standing right there with you as we try to dismantle both white supremacy and Christian nationalism from our culture and from our churches.
Darnysha, I'm going to agree very much with Amanda, and given what she said, I'm going to go deep into the story that the illustration that you used. I've long valued you as a minister. You were ordained in the church that my family and I attend, and I was honored to participate in that service. And I know about your deep convictions, not only in terms of the gospel, but in terms of the way in which the gospel is to be expressed on issues of justice, reconciliation, and compassion. So here's what I would say. If they ask you to drop these kinds of responses that you have made to issues of justice from social media, they will ask you to drop other things along the way. And there are some situations where knowing that going in means you shouldn't go in at all, because these days, churches and church-related organizations are being impacted by major forces that contribute to division in those congregations or those organizations already. The declines in the engagement in religious life across the spectrum in denominations and religious life has created a sense of great angst, great struggle, and in some cases fear in these organizations as they see their constituencies aging or their budgets declining or those kinds of institutional realities. And so the division around these issues is only increased by the times. But in this particular incident, you do illustrate, again, some of the things we've been talking about today. And I think that if I can get probably too gospel about it, there are places where you need to shake the dust off your feet and know that you're going to be asked to continually compromise if the entering in process involves that kind of compromise and really, and please use the pun, whiting out your webpage.
So I'd like to thank you both for joining our common conversation today. I'd like to thank the people who came and their really thought-provoking and insightful and passionate questions. I would like to end by saying, if anybody here who came and really appreciated this conversation today, if you would like to learn more about BJC and Christians Against Christian Nationalism, visit bjconline.org, and you can also visit christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. Again, if you would like to learn more, visit bjconline.org, and you can visit christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. Again, I want to take a moment to just thank our guests here, our experts, for their wisdom, for their passion, for their prophetic preaching of the gospel, which is for the sake of justice, compassion, and reconciliation for us all. And so thank you, Bill. Thank you, Amanda, so much for giving us your time and giving us portions of yourself today.
Well, thank you, Darrell and Bill. As always, I learn every time we have a conversation about this. I learned from those who asked questions today, and I'm grateful to be on this path with both of you and our audience as we try to dismantle Christian nationalism.
I also am grateful for this opportunity and to learn from everyone who's had a voice in this gathering today. I do want to say, as a longtime friend and in many ways beneficiary of the Baptist Joint Committee, that I hope our listeners will know that this committee benefits persons inside and beyond the Baptist network and world, and that their engagement in amicus briefs and friend of the court responses across the political and theological spectrum has been a model since the 1930s of ways in which persons of Baptist identity can engage and encourage religious liberty in the best sense. And the early Baptists of the 17th century, I think, would be delighted to know that their vision continues through organizations like the Baptist Joint Committee. So thank you for today.
Outstanding. Well, again, thank you all, everyone. This was a wonderful and full gospel education. If I can take anything away from my time at Wake Forest Divinity and my time as a student under Dr. Bill Leonard, is that the man definitely knows how to preach a good gospel education. And so that carries forward into our conversation today. So everybody be blessed. Stay tuned for more coming from Common Conversations and Wake Divinity programming.
If this is your first Common Conversation, then I encourage you to join us for all three this fall as we talk about the weight of racism. Don't miss our discussion on the load of Christian nationalism and Baptist history in October, or Black Baptist burdens and white Baptist pressures in November, and our concluding conversation on the gravity of trauma in these enmeshed communities in December. And stay tuned for a new series next semester. You can find more ways to connect to the Baptist Commons or Wake Divinity by visiting our website at divinity.wfu.edu.